For our 50th wedding anniversary, I was celebrated as an expert in marriage. I have never felt like a bigger imposter. Our kids threw us this beautiful party. Friends were there, family. A nephew came up to me, glass in hand, and asked me for the secret. I smiled. I gave him the standard answer, the one you hear in movies, about compromise and never going to bed angry. Everyone nodded. But later that night, lying in the dark next to my sleeping wife, I felt like a complete fraud. The secret? The secret was that in a house full of our shared memories, I felt profoundly lonely. The woman I've spent more than 50 years with was just a few inches away, but she felt miles apart. I love her. I can't imagine my life without her. But somewhere in the last decade, we had become more like business partners. We ran the enterprise of our life together. We managed the house, the bills, the doctor's appointments, but we'd stopped talking, really talking. And the silence, it was deafening. The worst part wasn't the distance itself. It was the crushing feeling that I had somehow failed her, failed us. And I had no idea how to even begin a conversation about it. That feeling, that gap between the two of us, it didn't happen overnight. It was a slow creep, so slow you don't even notice it until one day you're standing in the middle of your own life and you feel like a visitor. I remember this one Tuesday afternoon, perfectly normal day. I'd spent the morning at the hardware store, finally got the garage door opener to stop making that grinding noise. I felt accomplished. She'd been busy too. I saw the pill organizers on the counter, all sorted for the week. Blue for Monday, green for Tuesday, everything in its place. Later we sat down for dinner. The house was quiet. We talked about the neighbor's new fence, whether it was too high. We were a well-oiled machine, a perfectly functional team. And then it hit me. We hadn't touched all day. Not a hand on the arm, not a brush of the shoulders as we passed in the hallway. We weren't a couple. We were the co-managers of a small, quiet corporation called Us, and we were very, very good at our jobs. I read something a while back from a psychologist named Esther Perel, and she said something that just stopped me in my tracks. She said that love needs to know everything about you, but desire needs a little bit of mystery. When you become purely functional partners, you spend your days solving problems, and you systematically, efficiently kill every last bit of mystery. You slide from passion into logistics. And listen, if you're hearing this and something is stirring in you, if you sometimes look at your partner and see a reliable co-manager more than the person you fell in love with, please just hear me. You are not alone. This is not a personal failure. It's the default path for millions of long-term couples. But this functional partnership, it often masks a deeper, more silent problem. A problem that has less to do with them and a lot more to do with the person in your own mirror. And untangling all of that, it's not a simple thing. It took months after that anniversary party just to find the right words to even start. It wasn't one single dramatic revelation. It was a series of small, sometimes very uncomfortable discoveries. And that process, it forced me to look at things I had spent a decade avoiding. It forced me to really look in the mirror and ask some hard questions. Not about her, about me. What I started to see was a pattern that began with how I saw my own aging face in that mirror, which then poisoned the way I spoke to her, or more honestly, the way I used silence as a wall between us. And all of that, I realized, was based on a completely outdated idea I had in my head about what connection was even supposed to look like at our age. I don't have a secret formula. All I have is the map of my own messy, difficult journey. And what I want to do is just walk you through the few hard-earned truths I found along that path. because I have a feeling that what I learned about my marriage might just have something to say about yours, too. So, how do you break a silence that's taken decades to build? It's not with some grand romantic gesture. It starts with admitting that one of our favorite ideas about love is a complete myth, the myth of spontaneity. I mean, look, in our 30s, a look across a crowded room, that was all it took. That could be the start of a whole passionate evening. Now, at 78, a look across the living room usually just means, hey, is it your turn to take out the recycling? It was my wife who finally called it. After one of our talks that went nowhere, she made this radical suggestion. She just said, let's schedule a date, next Thursday, 7 o'clock. And I have to be completely honest with you. My immediate gut reaction was, how pathetic. Pathetic. We live in the same house. We share the same bed. And now we have to pencil each other in, like a dentist appointment. It felt like we were admitting failure. But we did it. We went to a simple local restaurant. We made one rule. We could not talk about our health, our finances, or the house. No logistics. The first 10 minutes were excruciating, just stilted, awful, like two strangers who secretly wanted to check their phones. And then, desperate for a topic, I just asked her about the garden she kept mentioning she wanted to plant out back. And everything changed. Her whole face just lit up. For the next 20 minutes, she talked about where she'd put the tomatoes and the basil she could almost smell. And I wasn't listening to the co-manager of our life. I was listening to my wife, to the woman I fell in love with. You know, a long marriage is like a house. For 40 years, you're busy with construction. The foundation, the walls, the kids, the noise. And then one day it gets quiet. And you discover there's a garden out back that you've both ignored for years. It's just overgrown with the weeds of silence. The job isn't to build more rooms. The job is to get out there together and just start pulling weeds. Asking her about that garden, that was the first weed we pulled. It was scheduled. It was intentional. And that one moment was more intimate than anything spontaneous that had happened in the last 10 years. So if the idea of scheduling a date with the person you live with feels awkward or forced, good. That's the feeling of breaking a rule. An old, unwritten rule that is just not serving you anymore. This fundamental shift, from waiting for a spark to intentionally building a small fire, that leads to the most important truth I've learned. And the truth I learned is this. The problem wasn't that we had stopped being spontaneous. The problem was that for 20 years we'd been working with the wrong definition of intimacy. Completely wrong. I used to think intimacy was just a code word for sex, for what happens in the bedroom. And when that became less frequent, less fiery, I thought intimacy was dying. I thought we were dying. Now, my definition is wider, so much wider. Intimacy is my wife bringing me a cup of tea, without me asking, just because she heard me coughing in the other room. It's us holding hands in the car, in total silence, on the way to a doctor's appointment. It's the time I finally admitted to her how scared I was of falling, of one of us falling and the other one being alone. And she just looked at me, her eyes so clear, and said, "Me too. Me too." 2 words, more intimate than a whole weekend away when we were 35. The physical part, it's still there, but it's different. It's quieter. It's more about tenderness than it is about raw passion. And that's okay, because it's become one part of our connection, not the whole story. And listen, it's perfectly normal to mourn the passion you once had. That's a real loss. I'm not going to pretend it isn't. But clinging to that one single definition of what love is supposed to look like, that's what blinds you to all the other deeper kinds of connection that are waiting for you right now. But to even begin to see those other connections, I had to face a much harder truth. I had to stop being at war with myself. I remember getting out of the shower one morning, catching my reflection in the foggy mirror, and I just stood there. The aches in my joints, the thinning hair, the way my skin doesn't quite fit like it used to. And my first thought, my gut, uncharitable thought was, no wonder she's not interested. But the criticism wasn't in her eyes, it was in mine. I was blaming her for my own private grief over the man I used to be. I read a study later that found a direct link between how negatively you see your own aging and how unhappy you are in your marriage. Simply put, if you don't like the old person you're becoming, it's almost impossible to let your partner love them. And if you feel that, if you've ever felt uncomfortable in your own changing skin, I promise you that is one of the most isolating feelings in the world. And it's nearly impossible to feel open and vulnerable with someone else when you are quietly at war with yourself. And that war, that's what fueled the silence. For years, my wife would ask me, is everything okay? And my answer, my shield, was always the same, fine. Because how do you say, I feel like you don't see me anymore? How do you say, I feel old and invisible and I'm terrified you feel the same way? It just felt too big, too dangerous. So fine was easier. Until one night, after one too many fines, she just looked at me and said, your fine is the loudest, most painful sound in this house. And she was right. My silence wasn't keeping the peace. It was a constant screaming announcement that I had checked out. A researcher, a man named John Gottman, he calls this stonewalling. He says it's one of the surest predictors that a relationship is in trouble. It's not just the absence of talking. It's an active shutdown. Now, I know what you might be thinking. My partner would never be open to talking about this. They're too set in their ways. I thought that too. I learned that the wrong way to start is to say, we have a problem. The right way for me was to start with myself. Not, you don't see me, but a lot harder for someone to argue with how you feel than it is to deny an accusation. And that quiet loneliness, that's what allows the great roommate myth to take over your life. You drift into it. You become these incredibly efficient co-managers of a household. I remember one specific Tuesday. I'd spent the morning fixing the garage door opener, finally. She had spent her morning sorting our pill organizers for the week. We sat down for dinner and had a very reasonable conversation about the neighbor's new fence. It was a perfectly functional day. And then it hit me. We hadn't touched each other. Not once. Not a hand on the arm, not a brush of the shoulders in the hall. We weren't a couple. We were the co-managers of a small, quiet corporation called Us, and we were very, very good at our jobs. If that sounds even a little familiar, if you sometimes look at the person you love and see a reliable, dependable coworker, you're not failing, you're normal. It's the default path. Now, you might also be thinking, this all just sounds like a lot of work. It shouldn't be this hard. You're right. It is work. We worked for 40 years on our careers. We worked on our finances, on this house. Why on earth did we ever assume that the most important part of our life, our connection, should run on autopilot? This isn't about one grand gesture. It's about choosing to do the small work. It is about planting one single flower in a garden full of weeds. This is not about restoring what you had. It is about cultivating something new. So, after all of this, where are we now, my wife and I, today? I wish I could tell you that we rediscovered the fiery passion of our 30s and that every day is a scene from a romance novel. But that would be a lie. And I'm done with lies. The truth is, our marriage today is a living document, one that we're still editing, sentence by sentence. There are still days of silence. There are still days when we pass each other in the hall and we're just two people who live in the same house. The old habits, they have deep roots. The difference is, the silence isn't empty anymore. It doesn't feel like a threat, and we notice it. One of us will look up from the newspaper or from the dishes and just say, "Hey, we're doing it again, aren't we?" And we'll just stop. And maybe we'll put on some music, or maybe I'll just go over and put my hand on her shoulder. That's it. That's the work. I've accepted that our connection isn't a monument we built 50 years ago, that we just get to admire for the rest of our lives. It's a garden. It needs constant, gentle tending. Some days, all you have the energy for is to pull one or two weeds. Some days you just sit in it quietly and appreciate what's there. And that's enough. It has to be enough. And honestly, I'm not sure I would even want that old passion back. That person, that man who was so sure of himself, so full of fire, he's gone. And the young woman he married is gone too. Trying to get back to them felt like chasing ghosts. The real work wasn't about resurrecting the past. It was about getting to know, with curiosity and a little bit of grace, the two people who are sitting here right now. And maybe, after 50 years, that's the final, most intimate introduction of all. So I think back to that 50th anniversary party, to feeling like such a fraud, celebrated for a success I felt I hadn't earned. The secret then, the one I kept locked away, was how lonely I felt. The secret now is that there is no secret. There's just the quiet, daily work of tending to the garden you both forgot you had. That house we built, it's done. The construction is over. And the truth is, the work was never about building a perfect monument to the past. It was always about learning how to live in the quiet rooms, together, and learning how to pull weeds side by side in the garden out back. The goal is not to rekindle the old flame. It is to find a new way to share warmth. And I'm genuinely curious about your story, about the warmth in your own life. So I'd love for you to tell me in the comments, what is one small, non-grand gesture of intimacy, something given or something you received, that has truly mattered to you recently? I'll be reading them. And if this kind of conversation is something you feel you've been missing, maybe stick around. There's a lot more to talk about.